The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMSI.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Humanity First. We're still, I think, in the new year. I'm always asking people, when is it too late to say Happy New Year? And I think you get the most of January to do that. So Happy New Year to everybody again. And today we're going to have an interesting conversation with a diversity and equity and inclusion expert, Felicia Heywood, who's been on the show before and is our executive vice president of diversity, equity, and inclusion, is going to talk to us around the seemingly DEI backlash that is happening at the moment, sort of 4 years on from George Floyd and all of the things that have happened since then, and what really is happening on the other side of the coin in terms of a backlash that is happening in this country and in fact all over the world. So that will be an interesting discussion. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about mental illness. That is something that I have been involved in all of my life, and it strikes me that there hasn't really been a time when I've been in the workforce, both in Britain and in America, where people who are providing this service have been struggling for resources and struggling for parity with the rest of medicine. It is a fact that most psychiatrists get paid about a quarter of what a vascular surgeon would get paid. And that sort of is reflected through to all of the people who are providing this kind of service in terms of mental wellness. And that doesn't bode well for the future. You know, we talk about college, we talk about the cost of college. You're looking at $70,000 to $80,000 a year for people to come into a profession like the healing arts and being a licensed practitioner of the healing arts. And, you know, paying those loans back is an awful lot of effort and a lot of time when you're earning $40,000 to $50,000 a year if you're a clinician. We face a bit of a dilemma and a paradox in this country. Over the last 5-10 years, there has been a great openness about mental illness. We have a generation now who are perfectly willing to talk about the time that they spend with their therapist. They see being in therapy, dealing with these issues as a natural consequence of the human condition, which I think that the new generation of folks should be very proud of. We are normalizing the idea of the brain and the health of the brain, which is really important. It's also helped by the fact that many famous people have stepped out of the shadows and talked about their mental illness, from sports people to musicians. I know Metallica, which is not a group that I follow, but there's a recent documentary about them where they actually talk about how going into therapy saved the band because they were able to work out many of the issues that they had. We are normalizing conversations about mental illness. In campaigns for presidency, there is usually a conversation about what we're going to do about mental illness. And it isn't necessarily about public health issues and mass shootings. It's about how do we get resources to people that need this kind of help. And in a society that we're in at the moment where there is so much conflict, I think it is fairly normal for people to feel emotional and mental health disruptions. The problem is we need more resources, we need more equity, and we need more thought about a public health approach to the mental well-being of the people of America. And as soon as we begin to think about it as a campaign, as a public health initiative, rather than an individual person seeking treatment, the better it is for all of us. We'll be right back with Felicia Heywood.
Hi, I'm Jamie. I'm an essential worker here at BAMSI, and I'm a nurse. Nurses are essential here at BAMSI because as nurses, we really have the opportunity to make an impact. We have very small ratios, so we have the opportunity to really learn everything about the person served and be able to give the best care. It really serves such a great purpose for me as being a nurse and really why I came into nursing. Learn more about nursing opportunities at bamsijobs.org.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMSI.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Humanity First. As promised in the first section, Felicia Heywood has joined us. Felicia, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
And for those who are not aware, Felicia is our DEI Executive Vice President, our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Vice President, Executive Vice President, sorry. It's good to have you back. You have been with us about
6 months.
About 6 months now. And actually, a lot has happened in that time. And maybe we should just take a little moment to reflect on, what your journey has been like over the last 6 months.
Sure. Thank you. So to begin with, it was interesting to come to work in a community that had already done so much work, right? So by the time I was hired and our department got off the ground, it was like a little bit of that show me the money place. So we had to think of some things that we could produce pretty quickly so we could keep people engaged. So some of the things we've worked on, we have the DEJA, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Justice, and Accessibility, or DEJA. We have consults. And consults happen with members of our community, staff, HR, a variety of people. We have our DEJA explorations. We have a new initiative called the B Shore, which is set up to provide support to staff people who are targeted by oppressive behavior or speech. We have our book club going. And most recently, we just launched our DEJA survey to really gather voices from people around the community to inform what will become our DEJA plan for the agency. Wow. We've been busy. A little bit.
No wonder everybody's so exhausted. But for a good cause, that I think, let's broaden this conversation out a little bit, because we're just an agency that's sort of trying to do our best and putting things together and actually getting a little bit of attention. In fact, I think an article that you and Sonia had written is going to be in our Providers Council newsletter, which really is talking about the benefits of being an organization that values diversity, equity, and justice. And in some ways, let's strip away that language for a minute, because on Sunday, there was a really interesting article in the New York Times about the backlash. And in a general sense, in America, it's really worrying in some ways, because George Floyd was a moment in time when, for whatever reason, and I think I know the reasons, the attention of America was sort of grasped and progress was made. I read the other day, and it was one of the employment data people said that, in corporate America, there had been, something like 6,000 layoffs over the past few months. And a third of those layoffs were people that had been hired post George Floyd in DEI positions. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because it's not like we fixed it, right? It's not like a little bit like the news anchor who said when President Obama became president, is this the beginning of a post-racial America? And I think everybody probably remembers that and the way it panned out. But we're in this situation now in America where there's beginning to be groups, right-wing groups, libertarian groups, one particular group that is run by a billionaire who is fighting tooth and nail against, and in fact got a significant victory in the Supreme Court recently around equitable admissions to universities, and another group who took on the president of Harvard and made it their job to remove that person from office. In a way, this movement is under attack. It's under attack legally around constitutional issues, which I'm not a constitutional lawyer by any stretch of the imagination. I don't play one on the radio either. But these challenges are coming from these efforts that are had. Talk to me about that. Was this something that you expected? Is this something that is in the course of the way in which things work in this world?
Sure. Yeah, I think a little bit. I'll answer sort of one of your last questions. Absolutely, this was to be expected. Whenever we have progress, it's always a little bit of a pendulum, right? You swing in one direction and there's going to be a swing back a little. After the murder of George Floyd on TV, which really captured the imagination of the world, a lot of people and a lot of agencies and a lot of groups made these commitments. And it was sort of in the fervor of the moment. And there wasn't a whole lot else going on because we were in the middle, except for this pandemic we were in. But, we were inside. People could start to lean into the work. There weren't as many sort of competing things going on. Now that we've come out to something of a post-pandemic world, economic challenges facing us, in a very uncertain world with so many wars and in this country, this upcoming election. And we know that in periods of uncertainty, people will sort of swing back to what they know, right? They'll buckle into what they know. So we could anticipate this kind of backlash. The other thing that I'll say about it is, in some ways, to me, it's a good sign, right? So I think whenever we make progress, it starts to be uncomfortable, right? And it doesn't become uncomfortable first, like little step, baby steps, maybe not even noticing. But it starts to reach a critical point where it's starting to have impact. And when that happens, there's going to be a pushback. So for me, it feels like, this pushback is a sign that we've made some progress. Now, we need to keep making progress. The question in front of us is really two things. Did we mean what we said after witnessing the murder of George Floyd? And how do we keep moving forward?
Right.
Around, below, and above, and through this pushback.
Do you think that we really know enough about what's going on? In other words, this article was really interesting because it said many organizations are taking legal advice about what they've done to promote equity, which is funny, right? If you think about it, I'm promoting equity. You better take some legal advice about that. Sign of the times. And what's happening, according to the article, is that some organizations are taking the foot off the pedal. That they are going into a gray area. They're redefining DEI. They're not using that expression. They're not doing anti-bias training. What they're doing is awareness training. Two kind of different things, aren't they? Whereas many other organizations are doubling down and saying, hey, we're in this for the long run. Two very different decisions with the same information in front of those organizations. Do you think it's true that if you stay the course and as somebody said in the article, if somebody's going to sue me for being equitable and inclusive, bring it on. Who's going to win out in this contest?
I have to believe that the side that is committed to equity will win out. That is the history of our very fraught history of our country. But in the end, good usually prevails. The legal challenges are not surprising to me in a world where we often think in zero-sum games, right? So the increase in rights for some people might feel like a loss of rights for others. And it is challenging, I know, to relinquish privilege. But in the end, we want to be on the right side of history. And I think when you look at images from the civil rights era, for example, and you see those very angry people barring children from going to school, and you just look at them now and you think, who are these people and what were they even thinking? We want, as the arc bends towards justice, and it does. So I ultimately believe we'll get there, but it's a long journey.
Yeah, you and I were at the Martin Luther King breakfast this past Saturday in Mansfield, and Joe Feaster was speaking, and actually I don't know if you saw him, but he was on the news last night as well. And Tony Feaster is somebody who's been involved in this fight for 40 years, and he made the point yesterday that I think you're making, which is if you look at this situation without history, it's a very different story. But if you look at, as he said, how people of color were denied the right to get on the housing ladder, for instance, because of ring fencing, because of all of those outwardly racist laws that were passed. Even if you want to go back to a Chinese population who came and built the railroads, there's a famous picture of the two railways coming from the east and the west when they hammer the gold pin into or nail. Mm-hmm. There's no Chinese people in that picture. We forgot that the railways were built by people who died and never saw their families, mm-hmm. and their families were stopped being paid when they died. That history paints a picture, doesn't it? That what we're doing is not taking away the rights of people, but redressing the balance.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And it's a conversation that has been happening for some time and is fairly long overdue. And I think, again, this idea of backlash, I think as we start to talk about things like redress, as we look at ways to sometimes level the playing field and sometimes demolish the field altogether and build a different field, there are going to be folks who feel hurt and injured by that. But what we do know is that the history doesn't actually go away. We can, certainly we're trying to not teach certain things in school, but the history persists. And one of the things that makes me optimistic is the younger generation. Mm-hmm. This is a generation who, by and large, have grown up in an era of talking about diversity and equity and who expect it. Right. This is a generation who is having some really lovely play and experimentation with gender and really expects, like, you will respect my gender identity. And so despite the attempts to obliterate some of our more challenging history, this group coming up who will lead the country forward is embracing the hard parts and saying, no way, we're going to keep moving toward justice.
Yeah. And that group of people look very different, don't they, from a couple of generations ago. There was another article that was talking about how people want to be described nowadays. And, it really, people are just saying, look, I'm not white. I am many things. And I think that's really helped as well, that sort of movement towards integration. And the voice of racism is still apparent and very audible, but it's not being heard in the same way, like a dog whistle, perhaps, that it was a couple of generations ago. It's still there. There's no question about that. But at the end of the day, I think when we think about who will win out, it is this generation that will bring us through. And in the first segment, I was talking about young people's response to mental health issues. As a kid, we did not talk about that. It was not something, it was a sign of weakness. My father was in the Navy, and, I would never have said to my dad, I'm feeling sad. I just would not, because I know what was coming back, which was police altogether. It is totally different now in so many ways. And I think that's where the hope remains, right?
I think so. I think, again, this is a generation who is really like pushing on any binary thinking. So not black and white, not either or. And so are just sort of flexible and open to the changes that are happening and really excited to push them through.
So final question. I think there's a big weight on a lot of people at the moment. And maybe if you're not paying too much attention to what's going on in our society where we are, as you said, there's efforts not to have a conversation about history, which is probably the most dangerous thing. If you think about fascism, if you think about the rise of reactionary governments, doing away with inconvenient truths is something that is sort of on the agenda for that. You are carrying a great deal of responsibility in our organization, which has a lot of people and a lot of people of color. We have 17,000 employees, and the majority of those people are not white. How do you manage the burden of that, knowing what's going around, in the world and the messages that you're getting? I know you're a very optimistic person.
I am very optimistic. And I have to say that I don't experience it as a burden. That's not to say I don't get tired, I don't get burnt out. But overall, I really experience it as this amazing privilege. And when I started working, I couldn't conceive of a job doing something that matters to me so much, right? So I don't feel burdened by it. I often, on a day-to-day basis, I'm like, I can't believe I get paid to do what I care about the most.
What a lovely way to finish. Yeah. Thank you, Felicia. And we're glad you're here. And there's a lot of work to do, but it's that kind of optimism, I think, that helps.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. See you next week.